All right, friends, I've got a plot spoiler for you, and it's a doozy. Israel's national project ends in a colossal failure. Okay, how do we get to such a failure though? And is there any hope for a future after the failure? That's the question. Where are we now in the plot? Okay, so the Torah has happened. God has created the world. God has made a covenant with Abraham and Sarah. God has said that he would give them land and kids. He has given them land and kids. Eventually, they found their way into the land in the book of Joshua. They had to have a pretty gruesome war in order to get it. They got into the land. They then have a series of leaders called judges who are kind of like miniature ruler, king, warlord figures. They're not the most stable of leaders, however, and by the end of the book of Judges, we have a huge problem. The problem being this. The narrator ends with a haunting line. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. The story is begging for a king. Are we finally going to get a king in here? Our material for this week is actually 6 full biblical books, which is probably impossible to really do with the time constraints that we have. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a plot summary, a disorienting, wild summary of the entire 6 books I'm talking about, and then we're going to go drill down on 3 dramatic moments that I think have a lot of meaning within this bigger arc, and then we'll close it all up in the end. What do you think? What are these biblical books we're talking about? Here they are, in order. A book called Samuel. Really, it's just the book of Samuel, but it's divided in contemporary Bibles into 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel. Then we have a book called Kings, which in contemporary Bibles is divided into 1 Kings and 2 Kings. And then we have some books called Chronicles, which actually repeat a lot of the material that's in Samuel and Kings already, but in a slightly different way. So I'm going to focus on the story as it is in Samuel and Kings here today. What happens in these books? Well, in order, here's the best I can do at a plot summary of 4 books of the Bible: 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, 2 Kings. Ready? Okay, so the book of 1 Samuel opens with a problem. There is a woman, yet again, motif, who wants to have a child, who can't have a child. Her name is Hannah. She eventually does have a child. His name is Samuel. She sings a beautiful song in praise of the Lord who has given her a child. This child, Samuel, ends up being a prophet who comes and speaks hard words against Israelites who are sinning at the time. Israel then falls into a huge state of struggle. One of their key national enemies, the Philistines, steal the Ark of the Covenant. Like, you can't have the Ark of the Covenant getting stolen, but there it happens. They steal the Ark of the Covenant. They have to get it back. They do get it back with God's help. The Ark of the Covenant is like God is fighting for Israel through the Ark of the Covenant. It's amazing. Okay, so they get it back, but we have a problem. If you can just get the Ark of the Covenant stolen, if all of Israel's leaders are sinning, doing the wrong things, there's no clear successor, the people want a king. Everything in the story should have been leading us up to getting a king by this point. And yet, when the people ask for a king, God is dismayed. Samuel is dismayed. God says, I am the king. And this is a theme you gotta know, that over Israel, God alone is king. This is a big time theme. Even if Israel will have human kings, God reserves the place of the monarchy for himself at some level. So this is a big deal. So God is upset. Samuel's upset, but God says, fine, they want a king, we'll give them a king. They get a king. His name is Saul. Saul ends up being an okay king at first. He's tall, he's a good warrior, but in fact, he ends up disobeying God, fails, and God says, we need a replacement king. So they get a replacement king. His name is David. God says, this is the king I want. He's a youngest son. He's a shepherd. God likes youngest sons and shepherds, as we will recall from patterns that had already been set out in the book of Genesis. So they pick David. David doesn't become the king right away, though. Awkward, because now David is the chosen king, while Saul is also the king, and they're sort of like battling each other like frenemies throughout most of the book of 1 Samuel. David really gets his start, though, in a big way when he has a battle with a famous giant named Goliath. David defeats the giant. Now he comes into Saul's company, but Saul's also very jealous of him. So they continue on and on like this throughout the book of 1 Samuel. Saul eventually wants to kill David. David gets driven out into the wilderness. He's wandering around. Saul is messing up. Everything is going badly. David's not the king yet. Saul is still the king. Samuel ends up dying. Saul wants to consult the prophet Samuel. He ends up visiting a medium, someone who communicates with the dead, sees Samuel's ghost. Samuel's ghost tells Saul, you're a failure, it's going to end badly. Saul ends up actually committing suicide at the end of the book of 1 Samuel. Now at the beginning of 2 Samuel, David alone is king. He consolidates the kingship. He sets Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. Ever wonder where that happens in the biblical story? It's in the book of 2 Samuel, right at the beginning. And David does a bunch of other things, consolidates his power. He wants to build a palace, and he asks God, can I build you a temple? Let's do this, let's make this official. But God has some words for David. He says, no, you will not build me a temple, rather your son will, but in fact, I'm gonna build you a house, in a sense. God says to David, I'm going to build you a royal house, and your successors will be king forever. David, though, has a problem. He ends up having an affair with a married woman and murdering her husband and trying to cover it up. God is not happy. Thus, most of the book of 2 Samuel is a punishment narrative against David, where God has all these things happening to David, to his family. He has a very dysfunctional family. His kids end up murdering each other, running around the country. David, in fact, gets kicked off the throne for a little while by one of his own sons named Absalom. Then that son, in fact, ends up dying, and then David comes back on the throne, and the whole thing is kind of a big mess. But we're left with the sense that at least David was God's chosen king, and he still maintains the throne. However, David can't live forever. His son Solomon succeeds him to the throne. Now that Solomon is the king, things are going well. Solomon is rich and wise, and he builds God a temple, a house. So now we have Jerusalem as the capital. We have a Davidic monarchy on the throne in the form now of Solomon. And Solomon's very excited about the temple and everyone's happy, except for Solomon too falls off the deep end. He ends up doing a bunch of things that God told him not to do in the narrative. So God is very upset at this. And when Solomon dies, the kingdom that had been a unified, wonderful monarchy that we've been waiting for this whole time now splits into two. And there's something like a low-key civil war going on throughout the rest of this narrative. In the northern part of the country, is a group that the narrator will call Israel, the northern kingdom, Israel. That's most of the people, most of the land. In the southern part of the kingdom, we have a group called Judah, which is just a little bit of the land and not most of the people. Crucially, though, in the southern part of the country, we have Jerusalem, the capital, and crucially, in the southern part of the country, we have the Davidic king, the Davidic monarchy, following in the line of David and Solomon. Who's king in this northern part of the country? Well, who's ever strong enough to be king. The first king is this guy named Omri, and then Ahab, and Ahab and Jezebel are a famous kind of couple up there that the biblical narrative casts as a very wicked group indeed. Indeed, the Bible has really nothing positive to say about this northern kingdom group. Prophets like Elijah and Elisha are sent up to that northern kingdom to criticize the northern part of the country. Indeed, this is the job of a prophet, to absolutely look a king in the face and say, what you are doing is wrong. It shall not stand. And so this happens. There's a big prophetic battle at one point between Elijah and some rival prophets. All kinds of murder and mayhem ensue. Then there's another prophet named Elisha who takes them through this other part of the narrative. Okay, now things reach ahead. The northern kingdom has just gone too far in the eyes of God. They sin so much that God says, you know what, I'm done with you. And a big empire to the east called Assyria, they come in and in fact they destroy the northern kingdom. They kill the kings, they wipe it off the map, they take the people into exile. No more northern kingdom. Now all that's left is that tiny little group in the south, Judah, around the capital, Jerusalem. Can they survive? As it turns out, no, they cannot. They too, despite some high points in kings like Hezekiah and Josiah, who worship the Lord in the right ways and maybe help keep up the temple, the rest of the kings are kind of a big failure. They fail to keep up their end of the covenant. They fail to obey the law. They fail to worship the Lord God alone. And God says, you know what, I've had enough. And in the end, the temple is burned to the ground. The last king of Judah, the last Davidic heir, Zedekiah, is killed. His sons are killed. And the people are taken off into exile. And the book of 2 Kings pretty much ends on that note, which is super depressing. How did it come to this? Does Israel have any hope or any future after this ends? That's the question. Okay, friends, we got to break this down. We're going to break this down into 3 parts. There's so much more we could talk about. I know I keep saying that in these videos. There's so much more, but it's because there is so much more, okay? But for now, 3 things. 1, we got to talk about this guy, David. He's the central figure, really, in this story, and he becomes a model for what a good king is, and indeed, later in our biblical story, a model for Jesus. So David, we got to talk about David. Number 2, we're going to have to talk about sin. What is it that's considered sin in the Bible? And what is it that these groups do that's so bad that God decides that it's so bad that he actually just needs to destroy them? Okay, so we're going to talk about that. And then, number 3, we're going to talk about prophets. Prophets play such a huge role in the Bible, so we'll give a quick definition of a prophet. We'll name a couple of these prophets, and we'll talk about what they do, what their message was. Okay, first, the drama with David. This really kicks up in earnest in the book of 1 Samuel chapter 16. Saul has just been rejected as king. The people chose him. God said, nope, I don't like it. And Saul can really just do nothing but wrong things. You almost feel kind of bad for Saul. It's a very tragic kind of story with Saul. And indeed, scholars have compared the story of Saul to the character and narrative arc that you find in Greek tragedy, Greek tragic stories about heroes who rise but have a flaw and also fall. In 1 Samuel chapter 16, here's how the narrative kicks it off. The Lord said to Samuel, how long will you grieve over Saul? Samuel's really upset about this whole thing. I have rejected him from being king over Israel. Fill your horn with oil and set out. I will send you to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided for myself a king among his sons. This image of the horn filled with oil, okay, is an important image for an important biblical word that we got to get to know. Oil, and the Hebrew verb for smearing someone with oil, is the Hebrew word Mashach. Do you want to say it? I'll say it, then you say it. Mashach. Mashach. You're like in a coffee shop just like saying a Hebrew word right now, okay? So from that word Mashach, we get a word Mashiach, one who is smeared or anointed with oil. That is the term from which we get our word Messiah. Messiah. So the word Messiah means in Hebrew one who is smeared or anointed with oil. It's a royal term. It's a term that has to do with priests and kings and being set out in an important moment for their task by God. The Greek equivalent of this term is the word Christos, which is where we get our word Christ. Okay? So to call Jesus, Jesus Christ, Christ is not Jesus' last name. It's a way of saying Jesus the Messiah. Okay? So this anointing imagery with oil is royal imagery. It's the imagery of the Messiah is the imagery of the king. David is chosen as that king. There's this whole little weird charade where they parade the sons out, and they pick not the oldest son, not the tallest son, not the sons who look right or act right or anything like that in a certain way that one might expect. Rather, God says, I have chosen a man after my own heart, David, the youngest son, the shepherd. Why does God prefer shepherds? You could do some reverse engineering and come up with all kinds of reasons why maybe the shepherding implies a certain kind of leadership, and certainly this is something that David is good at, keeping a flock, defending a flock. He's a good warrior. But really, we're not given in exposition form in the Bible why God prefers shepherds. He just does. He just likes it. He likes the image of a shepherd and a flock. Nor are we told why God keeps having this preference for the youngest son. We saw this way back in the book of Genesis. And we've hit this theme before, right, in these videos, how, in fact, the Bible is a story that keeps telling the same few stories over and over again in really powerful ways. So this chosenness of the youngest son is a story the Bible keeps telling. Remember Cain and Abel, but way back in the book of Genesis? Preference for the younger son, no clear description why. Preference for Jacob over Esau, younger son. Preference for Joseph, who was a younger son, and so on and so forth. So David follows in that typological pattern, we might say, okay? And here's another theme to note about David. It's this theme of chosenness, the theme of election. This is a big biblical theme, and it's a mysterious one. Why does God want the things God wants? Why pick Abraham and Sarah over any other people just living out in the ancient Near Eastern world of their time? Why choose David over some other son and some other family? There's a sense in which we want to go for a search for inherent qualities in the person. God chose Abraham because he just kind of saw something special in him. Or God chose David because he had some kind of special way of dealing in the world. And you can find some evidence for that, perhaps. But sometimes you just can't. You really run out on that, and you're just thrown back into a lot of what I think is just basic mystery. Why does God prefer what he prefers? You could even think of it on the terms of relationship. Like, why are you friends with the people you're friends with? Why do you fall in love with the person you fall in love with? You could think of reasons, but a lot of our reasons are actually reasons we come up with post facto for these things. We're just drawn to what we're drawn to. We have these guttural heart responses to the world. And this is the way God seems to look at this with David. He has a guttural heart response to him. He says he's a man after my own heart. Okay, by the time David fully becomes king, when we get into 2 Samuel, there's an astounding chapter that you really need to read and you really need to focus on if you want to understand some of this royal imagery, especially as it's going to carry forward in the Bible into the New Testament. It occurs in 2 Samuel chapter 7. David says to God, God, I got to build you a temple. I got to build stuff for you. I'm a king now. You're God. I got to build you stuff. So let me do it, okay? And God, surprisingly, says, no, I don't want you to build anything for me. Rather, I'm going to build something for you. He says, I'm going to give you victory over your enemies. And I'm going to give you some other things too. I'm going to read here from 2 Samuel chapter 7, particularly from verse 12 and onward. Actually verse 9. I have been with you wherever you went, and I have cut off all your enemies from before you, God says to David. And I will make you a great name, like the name of the great ones on earth. And I will appoint a place for my people Israel, and I will plant them so that they may live in their own place. Do you notice those two elements back from Abraham? Land and kids, right? The place and the name, descendants and a place to live. So God is still promising this thing to Israel in the form now of David. Further, he says, verse 12, when your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your ancestors, that means when you die, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come forth from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be a father to him, and he shall be a son to me. Notice the father-sonship language. So this language of the king being God's son, this is important language now, which is being established. It's royal language. It's the father-son relationship between God and king. When he commits iniquity, when he does the wrong thing, I will punish him with a rod such as mortals use, with blows inflicted by human beings. So I'll punish him. If he messes up, I will punish him. But I will not take my steadfast love from him. In Hebrew, that word for steadfast love is chesed. Chesed. Steadfast love. This kind of abiding ability that God has to stick to the plan no matter what, in a way that he doesn't have to do, but he chooses to do with Israel. I will not take my steadfast love from him, as I took it from Saul, whom I put away from before you. Why did he take it away from Saul? Again, Saul did some bad things, but was it really enough to justify it? Like rationally? Can you rationalize it? I'm not sure how rational this process is, right? It's a matter of election. It's a matter of choice. Your house and your kingdom, God says to David, shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever. No term limits, no end, and ultimately no conditions. It's the promise of a Davidic throne to David and his ancestors forever. That's a big promise. Okay, second, I want to talk about this question of why does God ultimately reject the northern kingdom? Remember in my plot summary earlier, I had said that this northern kingdom had split away. They had done their own thing up there. And they had other kings that were not part of the Davidic line. Well, there you have part of the answer right there. They broke from God's plan for leadership. God's plan for leadership set out in 2 Samuel 7 is that, in fact, the king would be an heir of David. Rather, in the northern kingdom, who gets to be king? It's kind of like who's ever strong enough to take the throne and be a king for a little while, and there's no familial line. It's not passed along always from father to son. So it's kind of a little chaotic up there, but really the Bible attributes this to sins that the northern kingdom commits, particularly in the following way. And here I'm looking in the book of 1 Kings, chapter 12 in particular. This is the chapter where the split happens, so you want to focus on that if you're reading along here, 1 Kings 12. This is where the split gets really painful. Up in that northern kingdom, the first king up there, his name is Jeroboam. He does a thing with echoes back to an earlier biblical story. He sets up at two locations, Dan and Bethel. Okay, two locations. Dan way in the northern part of the country, and Bethel further south, kind of like pretty much near Jerusalem. He sets up alternate temple sites, shrines we might say. He sets up a calf at a site where people are to worship. It's not clear whether they're supposed to really worship the calf or whether the calf is just a symbol of Israel's God or something like that. But whatever the case, Israel's God is not all about these calves. Because of the echo back with, you guessed it, the book of Exodus. Way back in the book of Exodus, chapter 32, the people, while Moses was up on the mountain, had set up a golden calf to worship. And God had said, no images, right? No worshiping other gods. None of this imagery. I'm not into it, God said, in the Ten Commandments. So when Moses came down, what did he do? He broke the Ten Commandments, just as the people broke them literally down below by worshiping the calf. So when Jeroboam, this king, sets up the calves, he says to the people, this is 1 Kings 12, verse 28, the king took counsel and made 2 calves of gold. He said to the people, you have gone up to Jerusalem to worship long enough. You don't have to keep going down there. That's politically awkward because they have a separate kingdom down there. You don't want to go worship down there. I've got perfectly nice places for you to worship here. Here are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt, which is an exact quote from Aaron, Moses' brother, which he says to the people when he sets up the golden calf at the foot of Mount Sinai. Do you see how those 2 moments are drawn into very close relationship with each other, right? The people's sin in the ancient era of the Exodus is the same sin in this era of the kingdom split. It's apostasy. It's falling away from the Lord. So basically, they are faulted for these kind of infractions. So too, the southern kingdom of Judah, they're destroyed as well. And we find out that they've committed some similar kinds of sins. Idolatry, worshiping as God that which is not God. Now this sets up really an explanation for why bad things have happened to the nation. You do bad things and you get punished in response to what you do. It raises a fascinating question about evil and about punishment. And indeed, this is a serious problem for Christians today, the problem of evil, or even the problem of suffering. Do we always suffer in exact proportion to what we do? Do you always suffer in exact proportion to what you do in life? Is it always like that? Is it some kind of like simplistic version of karma? Is there ever grace? Why doesn't God show grace to the northern kingdom? If he's going to show grace to people, why not to them? If he's going to show grace, why not to the Davidic line in the south to let them survive? It's not totally clear. He warns them though, and he warns them a lot, and he warns them through prophets. What is a prophet? The Hebrew word for prophet is navi. And the prophets are those who speak on behalf of God to the people. In fact, in the Bible, we find a special relationship between the prophet and the king. There are some prophets in the Bible before kings arise, but the institution of prophecy really gets raring red hot when we get kings. Kings are those who have tremendous power over people, but prophets are the voice of God, and they will get in the face of the king at the most awkward times possible and say the harshest things you can imagine. And you can think to yourself, like, does this role of a prophet, does this function in our society today? Whether you're a person of faith or a Christian or not, you could certainly think of people, maybe musicians, maybe political figures, maybe cultural figures who in your life, for you spiritually or even not spiritually, kind of like speak truth to power. And prophets do this. One of the big prophets we meet in this story in Samuel Kings is Elijah. He just marches right up to the king. This is in 1 Kings 17, I think, yeah. 1 Kings 17, Elijah marches right up to the king at that time, Ahab, and just says, God is not happy with you. There's going to be a drought. You're going to suffer. You are not the right king. Goodbye. And there's a drought, right? And then Elijah ends up having this contest with these rival prophets, and he defeats them, and it's this very dramatic story. To talk to a king like that, though, is to risk your life. We find this also out in David's story in 2 Samuel, I think around chapter 11, 12, 13, in that zone. We have a prophet named Nathan who confronts David right after David has committed an egregious sin, just abused his power to extreme degrees. And the prophet says, you did this, right in his face, right? So God has people on his side. God has these prophets speaking for him. So we have kind of an early generation of prophets like Samuel the prophet, and then we also have Nathan, and we have Elijah and Elisha. Then we have another very significant group of prophets who all probably historically, if they were historically real figures, and I think that they were, who lived during the 8th century BC, that is the 700s. This is Isaiah, this is Amos, this is Hosea, and this is Micah. They all had very different messages, and you can read their books full of their sayings, and you can get a sense of what they had to say. But one thing they all had in common, they wanted to talk to very rich and powerful people and say, do not abuse your power, don't you dare. Do you think that you can cover up for your abuses of power by simply doing more sacrifices or just saying the right words? No way. I want to read to you some very famous words from the book of Amos, who's one really good example of this. This is from Amos chapter 5. Can you imagine saying this prophet, right at the height of Israel's power? A prophet like Amos comes in and says words like this. I hate, he's speaking for God in the first person, which is a pretty audacious thing to do, but this is what a prophet does. I hate, I despise your religious festivals. I take no delight in your solemn assemblies. Even though you offer me your burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. And the offerings of well-being of your fatted animals, I will not look upon them. Take away from me the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the melody of your harps, but let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. Can you imagine, those of you who go to church, can you imagine someone standing up in your church and saying something like that right in the middle of the height of worship? Someone grabbing a mic and being like, shut up. Shut up with your stupid songs. There is sin in this group, and until you do justice, you can't sing enough songs to make me happy, says the Lord. Can you imagine someone saying that? That's the kind of language that we find here. Okay, and that's powerful language. In fact, if some of those lines even sound familiar to you, even if you've never read the Bible, let justice roll down like waters, they were used in a very important speech at a very crucial moment in American history. They were used by the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on the steps of the Capitol during his famous I Have a Dream speech. Right? Let justice roll down like waters. The words of the prophets rung out during the civil rights movement. These are words that have power today, not just in some ancient time. In the very beginning of 1 Samuel chapter 1, there's this beautiful story of Hannah. We haven't talked a whole lot about women. You're like, are there women in these stories? Are these just stories about men doing man things, prophets and so on? No, they're not. The Bible gives an extraordinary amount of space to a woman, a woman who's in a sad situation, Hannah, in the book of 1 Samuel. She is just grieved in her heart because she wants to have a child with her husband. Her husband doesn't understand her struggles. She tries to go to kind of like what the equivalent of church might be in her time, and the priest there, he doesn't get it. He's just like, oh, great, yeah. She cries out directly to God, and God hears her, and God grants her a son, the boy Samuel, who becomes a mighty prophet. And when God grants her that child, she sings this gorgeous song in 1 Samuel chapter, where is this? I'm just going to find it. Oh, here it is. It's in 1 Samuel chapter 2, Hannah's prayer, Hannah's song. My heart exalts in the Lord. My strength is exalted in my God. My mouth derides my enemies because I rejoice in my victory. And she sings this jubilant song to God. This song is repeated later in the mouth of another character named Mary in the New Testament when she is granted a child, namely the baby Jesus. So Mary and Hannah are actually put in this interpretive relationship with each other by their sharing this song of praise to God with the birth of a child who works to save Israel. First, the prophet Samuel here, who works to help Israel in his own time, and then later Jesus in the New Testament. Okay, friends. So we have some serious looming questions at this point. Israel's historical epic is one that ends in disaster, the burning of the temple. Is Israel finished as a nation? The prophets warned Israel that if they did not obey God, if they did not follow their end of the covenant, that this would happen, and it did. Now what? What happened to God's promise to Abraham and Sarah way back in Genesis chapter 12, that he was going to bless the entire world through their descendants? How is that possible now when that very lineage, when that very nation seems to be dead? What happened, by the way, to the covenant with David? God promised David that he was going to give him this eternal kingship, that it was going to go on and on. It looks very much at this point in the story like it is not going to go on and on. Israel was not faithful to its end of the covenant, true. But the very serious question has been raised. Is God going to be faithful to his end of the covenant? God promised this to David with no conditions whatsoever, in a sense, that kingdom would endure. Is it? How can it? And that's where we're left at the end of this part of the story.
Really good. How'd you feel about that?
Good.
Shape it, Brian. Get what you need.
Approximately 10% of my life has just been cleaning my glasses up to this point. Okay. Okay, I just need a second. I just need a second. Oh, good. Now that happened.
That's perfect.
Yeah. I'm timing it. I'm working with the universe. Reality is our friend. I don't want you to have to search for it. Get this out of my face. Okay. Why is this thing in my head? Scratching my head.